Okay, so we have Stephen and Chris are bouting at longsword with steel Federschwerts, they're called, which is a type of 15th and 16th century German practice or fencing sword for the longsword. They are slightly lighter and a lot more flexible than the real longsword, and obviously they're blunt, they're not sharp. This means that they can hit each other when they've got the proper protective equipment on. But also importantly, it means that they can thrust each other without hurting each other because the blades are flexible, much like a modern foil or épée. In fact, this is really a kind of ancestor of the modern foil or épée. However, the weapons are pretty much this sort of 7/8 the weight of a real longsword. So they move the right speed, they're balanced in the right way, and they do hit pretty hard, so we have to wear quite a lot of protective gear. What they're doing at the moment is they're not fighting to score points, they're not fighting to a specific number, although usually if we're fighting in a competition, then you would obviously be trying to attain a certain number of points, or rather not get hit a certain number of times. They can hit with either front or back edge, or with the point, and indeed they can also hit with the hilt, with the pommel or the crossguard, and they can hit with parts of their body, and they can wrestle. So they can punch and they can kick if it's appropriate, and they can come into core a core. If two people with long swords come very close, it will often turn into wrestling. And sometimes the longsword will be used to assist in that wrestling, much like a sort of lever or a staff. And of course it can still cut and thrust. The type of fencing they're doing at the moment is very much specifically what's known as blossfechten, or shirt fencing, that is unarmoured fencing. So they're fencing as if they were wearing civilian clothes. So they're not wearing helmets or armour of any kind. Armoured fighting with swords looks completely different to this, because of course armour of the time, plate armour, was very, very protective and very good proof against most weapons of the time. So it's actually very difficult to wound someone wearing armour, and therefore you come very close, and it is more like wrestling with almost like a short spear. You actually hold the sword in what's called half swording, where you grip the blade halfway up usually with your left hand, and use mostly the point to stab into gaps in the armour, such as the armpit, anywhere around the helmet that's exposed, the groin, the insides of the elbows, the backs of the knees, the back of the gauntlet, anywhere you can find a gap in the armour, so-called chink in the armour. So what they're doing at the moment is essentially akin to civilian dueling. So before the famous age of civilian dueling with the rapier and the small sword, in the Middle Ages people used to duel with either long swords like these, or what's called sword and buckler. A buckler is a small round shield, and the type of sword used for that would be a one-handed sword. This is what's known as a hand and a half sword, or it's not really a two-handed sword, although it's used with a two-handed grip most of the time. We call them usually long sword or hand and a half sword or bastard sword. They're called hand and a half sword or bastard sword because they can be gripped either with one hand or with two hands. Usually they'll be gripped with two hands when fighting on foot, but if you were fighting on horseback, you would need to grip the reins of your horse with one hand, so you would use the sword in one hand with the other hand. And you can't really use a sword two-handed on horseback, it just doesn't work very well. What we saw there, incidentally, was a complete double kill, so they both thrust each other in the face.